New Testament now. A couple of things that are important here. 5a on my outline. I've already alluded to this, which you probably already know. So, to be a disciple is to be a learner. Okay. So if you're called to make disciples, you're called to make learners. If you're called to be a disciple, you're called to be a learner. That's a lifelong learning project. It's not learning once in what was static, as we put on the board, but progressive and ongoing. Right? Bottom of the page, top of 22, this verse that you're probably familiar with, Jesus appointed the 12, he named apostles so they might be with him. It's an interesting verse, right? The calling of the disciples to be in the presence of Jesus, to accompany Jesus, to be the ones that are with him. Right? And that the teaching that Jesus does to those disciples, and he's really, putting all of his eggs in the basket of preparing these disciples to carry on after him, which is quite a risky venture, you must admit. Like, oh my goodness, would you have done that? Put your eggs in the basket of 12 disciples? Pretty unruly lot as it is. Not well prepared for the job. Haven't passed any exams. Anyway. The key to the starting point, and in many ways the key to the operation, is calling the 12 to be with him. So the point I want to make is that the teaching that Jesus does on the road, on the highways and byways, a la what you might expect from Deuteronomy 6, is in the context of relationship. Okay? Everything comes out of this relationship. So that in the relational context, as he knows them and they know him, as they love him and he loves them, teaching happens. It's all relational. It comes out of this call 12 to be with him. So the teacher-learner dynamic is ultimately all about relationship. Jesus seems to know this. Right? The other thing I want to just mention quickly is this Luke 6:40 text. The disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. This is beginning to touch into the larger goals that Jesus has for his teaching. The larger goal that Jesus has for his teaching fits the larger paradigm of the New Testament, I believe, in saying that the goal of the enterprise is that people will become like Christ. Right? The goal of spiritual formation is by faith in union with Christ, you become like Christ. Right? This is what Jesus is talking about. Right? That's not just once or twice, but it's pervasive. It's all over the place that you're actually imitating the exemplar of faith. You're becoming like Jesus. So Jesus is the one who's making this very point, becoming like the teacher. So in the teacher-student relationship, the master-disciple relationship in the Jewish context in the ancient world, the teacher is not just the one who gives content at the level up here of ideas, right? It's not just about the head, it's actually about living a life. It's about the hands, and it's about the feet, and it's about the heart. It's the exemplar is an exemplar of what it is that you are striving to be, right? So the teacher-student relationship is an exemplary relationship, right? So that the imitation of that teacher is expected. Right? So for Jesus in his teaching, he actually is after people that will become like himself. They will take on his values, they will take on his priorities, they will take on his way of being in the world. Right? So this is a relationship towards transformation of becoming like Christ. So to fill that out theologically, we can spend a lot of time doing that. But that's the direction that this goes. So in terms of those of you that are active in church settings and church Christian education settings, what's the goal of the enterprise? The goal of the enterprise in biblical terms goes beyond just knowing the content. Content is important. Fundamental knowledge is important. Remember Fink's diagram. This level can't be bypassed, but this level is not the end of the game. right? The end of the game is the transformation of the whole person towards a way of life that looks like Jesus, towards putting the values and priorities and commitments of Jesus into our own lives so that we live them out and we actually look like him. Okay? So content is good. I'm a heavy content guy. I'm giving you 157 pages of content. Right? No one has ever accused me of being light on the content side. Right? But the content itself is not the point. Okay? The transformation of the learner and the growth of the learner to become like Christ is the point. Okay? So that involves engaging the whole person with an approach and a strategy, if I could use that word, that engages the whole person. Okay? I think we tend to have a lot of information parked in our heads that doesn't actually find its way down through our systems. Right? There are some forms of church, if I could be a little bit critical now, that seems to be that always pouring more content, more content, more content, more content upon their people. Until there's way too much content for people to absorb, way too much content to really ingest, way too much content to really live. Right? And I wonder whether we just overboard on the content and underboard? That's not really quite a word. Don't do enough with the rest of this, which is, what are we doing with this? How are we applying this? What difference is this making with us, right? So the more you load new content on before you've digested the old, it's kind of like just eating too much, right? If you haven't really digested it and you just keep eating more and more and more and more and more, what does that do to you? You get indigestion. There we go. Exactly. Yeah. It starts like, oh, I'm not sure this feels so good anymore. Right? So I'm all for content, but I just wonder whether we neglect some of the other. It's about balance, right? It's always about balance. Right? So as we design programs and seminars or workshops or Sunday school classes or small group experiences, what I would urge people to think about is what's the overall balance here, right? In terms of this diagram. Are we just feeding all the more up here in the head? Is it lots and lots and lots and lots? What about this level? What about this level? Right? How are we enacting? How are we living? What are we doing with this stuff? Right? Because we often learn what something really means when you have to put it into practice, when you have to use it, when you have to do something with it, right? Doesn't always necessarily start by pouring content in the head. Learning can start by stuff that you do with your hands and your feet. Right? So if you want people to learn about, let's just pick a hypothetical topic off the top of my head, ministry to the poor, something like that. You can have a bunch of lectures about ministry to the poor, and you can make that the starting place, and you can have a lot of content and maybe even a lot of PowerPoint slides. How about that? Make everyone happy who loves PowerPoint. Or you can actually begin at the experiential level and you can actually go out and serve the poor, right? You can actually go out and spend time with the poor. You can go out and, shed blood, sweat, and tears with the poor. And then you can actually come back and start to think about, what is it that we experienced? How do we reflect upon this? What does this have to do with the teaching of Jesus about the way that we relate to the poor? Right? It doesn't have to start at an abstract theoretical level. It can actually start in lots of different places, but it can also start at the more experiential level. Right? So I'm just a little afraid of the overdoing of content and the underdoing of other elements that are more holistic, and ultimately they all need to come together to be transformative. The biblical notion of heart is, just to tease that out a little bit, is the core of your person. It's the core of your personality. It's the center of who you are, and it is, as the comment was saying, it's a sort of blend of both the mind and the affections. Right? It's both. We tend to separate out mind and affection pretty, drastically and differently. That's not the Hebrew way of thinking. It's much more holistic, right? So another theme in this material is, and the Jewish scholars here also point this out, which is the Jewish tradition is very strong on understanding, right? very strong in understanding the commandments, understanding the revelation, applying your mind to things. It is not anti-intellectual at all. And the Jewish tradition, if some of you are familiar with it, should know that. It has actually a very high standard of learning. The rabbi is a teacher first and foremost, because there is attentiveness to study what the Torah says, right? Supremely important, right? But along with that level of understanding, it is not simply cognitive, it is much more holistic. It is a matter of the heart. And there's my heart again. It's from the core of who you are. It's about the transformation of what it is that you are deep down inside, right? So it's a sort of blend of the cognitive and the affective into one. That's really who we are as people. Not segmented out, but actually it's much more integrative. Okay? So lots to learn from the Jewish tradition.